Clemson or bust. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, breaking down the college football playoff scenarios in each conference. We've knocked out the SEC. Please check out that video and let us know what you think. We have stopped in the ACC, where this has become a one-team league. That's it. It's Clemson. It's all on you, and it has been since 2015, since you took over for the one team that took the mantle for the ACC the previous 3 seasons. That would be Florida State. Clemson or bust. An undefeated Clemson team, as they stand right now, not being challenged by anyone. They met their last challenger Saturday night at Chestnut Hill and defeated Boston College 27-7. They have been rolling on offense and defense, and there is a 100% certainty that Clemson, if they go undefeated and win the ACC championship game, that they're in the playoff. Okay. How about a one-loss Clemson team? So that one loss as a conference champion would either be to Duke or to South Carolina. Duke is Clemson's last ACC game. That's at home. They also have to play South Carolina. So they're playing 2 decent teams, not 2 great teams, elite teams, nobody in their league seemingly, but they're playing another Boston College kind of team, North Carolina State type of team when they play Duke and South Carolina, 2 teams that are 7-3 and 5-4. So they're going to be 3 touchdown favorites. So it's very unlikely that Clemson's going to lose either one of those games, but we're playing the scenario. So let's say Clemson loses, and I think it would be to their benefit actually to lose to Duke. They're going to be the ACC champion, but they lose to Duke because they can get the loss out of the way, and then they can make up for it by beating South Carolina impressively and winning the ACC championship game impressively, rather than losing after beating Duke, losing to South Carolina, coming off a regular season loss in the finale, then going and playing the ACC championship game, in which they really can't make up for a bad loss because they're not going to be playing an upper echelon team in the ACC championship game. Unlike an Oklahoma, who may face a West Virginia or Texas, or in past years where Ohio State took on a 13 or 12-0 Wisconsin team last year, or the Alabama-Georgia situation in which they're both elite teams. Clemson doesn't have that challenge. They also don't have that luxury or that fallback of losing a game and then relying on an impressive win in the ACC championship game. It's not coming. They're most likely going to face a team that is 7-5 or at the very best 8-4. Pitt controls the ACC Coastal Division right now. They sit at 6-4, having won all these games consecutively after getting off to a rough start against the best non-conference schedule in college football. So Pitt, although not looking impressive right now, does have the narrow loss to Notre Dame. They did go get blown out against Central Florida and Penn State, but those 3 games blow away any other non-conference schedule in the country, only to be challenged by USC and Texas in particular. But to be facing those 2 teams out of conference, or those 3 teams out of conference, Pitt now at 6-4, sneaking close into the top 25. If they finish impressively at 8-4, they'll be roughly ranked, let's say, 20th in the country. So it's not as bad an opponent as it appeared to be a couple weeks ago. It could still be Virginia. It could be Virginia Tech, most likely not Virginia Tech, although they now stand with 3 losses in the ACC. So it's pretty much Pitt has played themselves into a tremendous position right now, and there's only a few other options out there, and we'll get into those later in the week when we look at the ACC. So Clemson is a one-loss conference champion. They get thrown into that same bucket with everybody else, meaning Michigan or Ohio State, whoever wins the Big Ten, with 1 loss, Oklahoma or West Virginia with 1 loss out of the Big 12, or Washington State if they run the table and finish with 1 loss in winning the Pac-12. Okay, this would be the pecking order, and that also includes Alabama if they would lose to Auburn, then win the SEC championship game, or Georgia if they would win out and win the SEC championship game with 1 loss. The pecking order would be this: Alabama would be the number one-loss team as a conference champion. They are considered the best team by far. They slip up against Auburn. Sure, that's going to hurt their credit, but then they would recover to win over Georgia in the championship game. So Alabama would be considered the most favorable, the most credible one-loss conference champion. Georgia would be number 2 because, again, they would have defeated Alabama, and they've already got wins over the likes of Florida, Kentucky, and most recently they've defeated South Carolina as well, and also beating Auburn. They'd have a win over Alabama. Georgia's the second strongest one-loss conference champion. Okay, who's number 3? That would be Michigan. Michigan's only lost to Notre Dame on the road by 1 touchdown. Michigan would be the third strongest one-loss conference champion. Ohio State would be number 4. I think it would be between Ohio State and Oklahoma, depending on how it's very close between the Buckeyes and the Sooners if Ohio State wins out, including a win over Michigan. Next in line would be West Virginia as a one-loss conference champion, and then Washington State. Where does Clemson work into that mix? Well, I think you got Alabama 1, you got Georgia 2, you've got Michigan 3, you've got Ohio State and Oklahoma would be close. Now, the weakness of the ACC would hurt Clemson here because they would rank lower if you're just basing it on resume, not talking about game dominance, the eyeball test, anything like that. I'm just talking about resume, who you're beating, who you lost to. The Clemson resume would drop then below Oklahoma and Ohio State and somewhere around West Virginia's resume because the Mountaineers did not play the main non-conference game on their schedule against North Carolina State, and then Washington State checks in at the bottom. All right. So most likely Clemson would be in decent shape there. Although, man, can you imagine Georgia with 1 loss as the SEC champion, Clemson out of the ACC, Ohio State or Michigan out of the Big Ten, Oklahoma and Washington State. We would have 5 conference champions with 1 loss, and Notre Dame with no losses or 1 loss. And then on top of it, Alabama would be sitting there with 1 loss as well. That would be a mess, and Clemson most likely would make it because it would be the SEC champion, Georgia. It would be Michigan for sure out of the Big Ten. If it was Michigan, Ohio State would get less of credit based on their horrible loss against Purdue. Clemson would be in the mix, in Oklahoma. Most likely that scenario is the SEC, the ACC, the Big Ten, and the Big 12 get in, unless Notre Dame's right there as well with no losses, and then you're knocking out the weakest of the 1-loss conference champions, assuming we've already got Washington State out in the cold. Then we've got to knock somebody else out to make room for an undefeated Notre Dame team, and that would be fascinating and a mess, and that would put Clemson in jeopardy. Undefeated Notre Dame and everybody else finishing with 1 loss as a conference champion, because we haven't even factored into Alabama being there as a selection possibility as well. All right. What if Clemson loses the ACC championship game? Then they really take a tumble, because if we have this glut of 1-loss conference champions, Clemson's going to have to get in line after all the 1-loss conference champions. That even puts them behind, most likely, Washington State. I would hope that would place them behind Washington State as a 1-loss non-conference champion, having just lost the conference championship game to a Pitt or whomever. All right. Fascinating. They would have the 1-game comparison against Syracuse, meaning Notre Dame played Syracuse. Also, Clemson beat Syracuse in a very close game at home earlier this season. So Clemson, they're in 100% if they go undefeated as expected and win the ACC championship game. I'm going to give them something in the 75 to 80% range. If they lose to what would be more beneficial to them would be against Duke, then recover and beat South Carolina and win the ACC championship game. But regardless, a loss in the regular season, then winning the ACC championship game, give them about 75 to 80% chance, because then they get compared to Michigan, possibly Ohio State, West Virginia, Oklahoma, whoever comes out of the Big 12 and the Big 10, or Notre Dame, Washington State, And then they really have a mountain to climb if they get upset in the ACC championship game, even if they enter that game undefeated. Our thoughts on the ACC, and it's all about Clemson. Would love to get your comments, your thoughts, and scenarios right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football.